In today's video, you're going to learn how to make an animated title card in Cinema 4D. Stay tuned. Hey everybody, it's Nick here from Greyscalegorilla.com, bringing you the tools, training, and tutorials to help make you a better motion designer. Now today's video is all about showing you how to make an animated title card sequence, but before we get started, I wanted to remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also check out our Intro to Cinema 4D series over on our website. I'm going to link it up down below. If you're new to Cinema 4D, make sure you check this series out. It's a completely free way to really step up your game in Cinema 4D. All right, let's head on into today's tutorial. So by the end of this video, you're gonna learn how to make this animated title sequence from scratch inside of Cinema 4D. Now we're gonna use some Mograph tools to get things rotating and get things blinking on and off. We're also gonna use some Greyscalegorilla tools like Signal and Topcoat to show you how we can really speed up the animation and texturing process. All right, with that, let's head on into Cinema 4D and let's get started. Okay, so here is what we're making today. And I just wrote the words glow type because that's kind of what we're doing. We're animating some letters kind of popping in here with like a blinky animation. Got a kind of a camera animation here. We got a reflective floor. So let's start building all of this in Cinema 4D and see what we can do today. So first thing we're going to need is a Motext object. And this is going to allow us to type whatever we want here. So in this case, I'm just going to say glow text. So because I want this kind of centered in the screen, I'm going to come down here and say middle. And I also want to choose a different typeface. Now for the example, I used Knockout. Knockout's a really great typeface. I recommend you purchase it. If you do a lot of type animation, it looks really good in 3D, and it gives you a lot of different widths. It gives you like this nice little thin one. You can see you can go all the way up to like this big chunky one, right? I'm going to pick something kind of in the middle here. Let's start with this one and see where we end up. Shall we? Okay, so we have our text. And let's just get the basic animation together, and then we'll start to do all the rest of it. So the main animation comes from a plane effector. So if you have your Motext selected, and that's important because when you add effectors, like the plane effector, if you have your Motext selected, it'll automatically add it to the letters part of the Motext. And this will allow you to use this plane effector to control each individual letter. Well, by default, you're just controlling them all together here. This is the Y position we're moving. But if you go to fall off and you go to linear fall off and you rotate it around, let's just rotate it 90 degrees, and then you move your plane effector, boom, you can animate your text, right? Pretty good so far. Okay, so what we're going to use this plane effector for is not just to animate, but also to change the color. So first of all, I want the full width of this linear fall off to be a kind of a fade out from here to here. And you can see now it's only going to here. And that's because this middle area, and they call it the fall off, this middle fall off is kind of set to 50% by default. So I'm going to turn it to 100. So now we're getting from all the way from one side to another, we're getting a gradient basically from one letter to the next. And so what we're going to do is use this plane effector to animate and also control the colors. And the way we do that is we go to parameter and we go to scroll up. We'll come back to you Topcoat later. Let's move you for now. And come on, there you go. Excuse me. Oh man. We're going to go to color and we're going to go to color mode and we go to on, right? And in fact, actually, let's go to user define. I think we'll have more control this way. But now we're telling the plane effector to control the color as well. So let's turn the color to black and let's see what happens. Well, interesting. We're getting a gradient now from one color to the next. Okay, and if we make this a different color, it'll transition between those two. However, to give us more control, I'm actually just going to leave it black and understand that the text itself is black here and it's white here, okay? So understand that this train going through it is affecting the color and the animation at the same time. So let's set up a pretty simple You know what? We'll get to animation later. Let's just sit this in the middle, and let's just go all the way through this glowing process, and then we'll start to set up the animation and cameras and stuff. So from here, we have to make a new texture. Okay, and the reason I left it black and white is because what we're going to do is we're going to come in, we're going to add this new texture to our text. You can see our colored text went away, our gradient text. And instead what we're going to do is come in here and go to our luminance channel. We're only going to use the luminance channel for now. And we're going to want to bring that black to white gradient into our luminance channel. And the way you do that is you go to Mograph and you go to color shader. Okay, now this color shader is going to pick up the color from this Motext that we made. Okay, so that's important because we want that black to white gradient coming through. Look, it worked, right? Without that on, it didn't work. With this back on, we get our gradient back. Okay, so now what can we do? Now that we're going from black to white, well, we can actually control the animation of color as our plane effector goes through. And so how do we do that? Well, let's open up our luminance channel here, which we already have open, and we're going to use a layer shader. Now, what a layer shader does is it brings whatever you have inside of this layer and allows you to layer up different shaders and kind of blend them together. It's almost like a little, imagine it like a little mini Photoshop inside of any one of your layers where you can mash stuff together and add blending modes and all this stuff. So what can we do now? Well, I can go to Effect and go to Colorize, and I could change the color from left to right as we add different knots down here. So first of all, let me just add a blue knot. Okay, now in the viewport, it just shows all blue, but if I hit render, it's also going to show all blue. I didn't get away with that one, did I? I messed up. What I should have done is add another color. So let me add a pink over here. Okay, so now in the viewport, it goes from blue to pink. It only displays pink, but hopefully if I did everything right, you're going to see it's going to go from pink to blue over the course of our gradient. Okay, so now what does this allow us to do? Well, this allows us to animate our lights coming on and off by animating our plane effector. Because if I want this here to start with, let's say we want it to start black. Okay, so everything's blue right now. So let's go to black. Let's make sure that works. Good, it works. Okay, so all of our letters are black. And then let's say we want it to blink. Okay, and this is the key part of this animation is we want, as this plane effector goes through, we want our text to blink. Watch, boom, 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 boom. See all that blinking that's happening? That's all going to be driven by this gradient. So if you can imagine this gradient as a train that's running through our text, we're going to want to basically give it some color here. So right now we want it to be all white. So that's our first blink. So, and we have to be a little tight here with our gradient. You may want to spread this out here. And so now it's going to flip from black to white, and it's going to ramp up into it. And then I'm going to copy and paste this black dot here. And I did that by holding down Command. And I made a second black dot. And then I'm going to blink it again. Okay. And now this time, let's blink it off, but not all the way off. Let's go to like a dark blue or something. Just give it some difference here. And I'm also going to pinch these knots a little bit to give it a little bit of character, right? We're animating here. Okay, and this is our animation running through our glow type. Okay, so now we need to ramp up into its brightest point. This is going to be, for me, and you can make it whatever color you want. In this animation, I made it like a hot orange, okay? And then it ramped into a bright red. Okay, so this is our animation. This is how it went down. So I'm gonna make the second one a little bit longer. I'm actually gonna make a white stay on a little bit longer to make this blink last longer. And hopefully it'll as soon as we get animating, you'll see what's going on. In fact, if we grab our plane effector and we just kind of move it into place here, I'm gonna shrink it down a little bit just so we could see both sides of it. You're gonna see that over here we have our X that is on this side of the effect, all the way down to the G, which is on this side of the effect. Okay, so it's reversed here. Okay, but that's okay. I think it's clear. White, orange, red. White, orange, red. And in fact, if I move the plane effector over a little bit further, these should be all the way black. They are. Okay, so now we have blinky text. Okay, good. So what can we do now? Well, let's animate our plane effector to run through this, and this will give us our animation. Okay, so I'm leaving the position on because there's really no sense. The color isn't showing, right? There's no sense of when this starts and ends, but I want it to be really close. So I'm going to start right before that G moves, right there. And I'm going to, I could set some keyframes, right? So we could do this two ways. You could set a keyframe, right? You could use this global keyframe thing here. And then over here, when it moves to 72, you could set another keyframe. And now you have your keyframe. And you could do this if you want to learn about the timeline and come in here and learn about that stuff. You go ahead and try to do that. I never really dug the way the timeline worked in cinema, and that's why we made Signal. So Signal allows us to animate and then change it very quickly. So it's basically a keyframing tool, and we sell this at Greyscalegorilla. And again, if you don't want to follow along with Signal, you could just keyframe this just like I showed you, and you could do the rest of the keyframes that way with the camera and all that. But what Signal allows us to do is basically do that same animation, but do it faster and also be able to change it faster. So it exposes all the parts of animation that I use constantly and allows us to make really nice animations without all the detail. So what I could do is in our plane effector coordinates, I want to animate this parameter, right? Because I want it to go from left to right, that's X. And I want it to go from our first position, which is, we could just dial this in right there. Let's go all the way to frame 0 so we can make sure. Right there. Okay, and then we go all the way to frame 72, which is our last frame. And then this will be all the way over on the other side. Okay, so now we're basically back to where we were. But now we have all this control with our curve and our timing. If we just want our timing to be a little bit faster, we could just change the time on our end time, and we could do that. What I want to do is make this a little bit more of a linear move. And I want it to start off a little bit linear, and then I want it to kind of fade out over time. So at first, I want these first letters to go blink, 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 blink really fast, and then the last little bit, I want it to fade to that dark red really slowly. And that we could do with a more aggressive curve. So we could go really fast and then ease into that last little bit. Okay, and then we can always test all these animations and see how they are, but that looks pretty good to me. Instead of the animation of our letters coming from top to bottom, though, I want them to rotate. So let's get our plane effector in the middle here. Let's go to our parameter and turn off position and turn on rotation. What I actually want are the letters to kind of animate like that. Okay, and I want them to kind of face the camera when we start. So let's actually go to frame 0, and let's try to get them to roughly face the camera. Now, we're going to use a slightly different camera, but I think that looks pretty close. In fact, I guess we could just do 90. And so now we have an animation with rotation and the color. Don't forget, this is also controlling our color, this one plane effector, right? So let's do a really quick test render and just see what we got, right? It's always good, especially before we add all the slow stuff, you know, lights and textures and all the things that take a long time to render. At this point, it may be worth just coming in here, going to all frames, and just kicking out a render here. And this is going to preview kind of what our colors are, what our animation looks like. And there we go. Really easy, and we're done. So pretty good, right? We got some blinky text. And if you don't like the way that your text is blinking on, or the colors or anything, you know you can come back into this texture, go to luminance, and go into our layer. And look at that, colorize. We could just change this gradient. Right? You could change your colors, you could change your blink timing, you know, make this look the way that you want. Okay, I'm digging this So let's start to add some more detail. We need to add our floor. We need to add some reflections to our type, and we need to add that camera animation as well. So let's start off with the camera animation, since we're doing our animation anyway already. And what I want the camera to do is to start here and to kind of go boom, right? It's a technical sound effect. It's popular on Tron movies. Boom, like that. Okay, so that's the main move. I also want the camera to rotate as it comes back, kind of similar, but imagine this sideways. So wow, a slightly different kind of tone. I could also tell you we're working in square mode right now, and I don't want to do that. I want it to be 16 by 9. So let's do that. Okay, and then so we're at 16 by 9, so that helps. So now I want to basically set up our final frame of animation, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's set up where our final frame is. First of all, let's grab a camera. Remember, try not to ever use a default camera in your scene, especially when you're animating. You can't do that. You need to pull in a camera. And then for this one, I'm going to be more of like a longer lens. And this is just going to flatten our type out a little bit more when we kind of rest on our final resting area with our camera. And so now I'm just going to figure out where the camera is going to end up. Okay, that's where I'm going to start with. Bam. Okay, so that looks good. We could read it, it's moving, and then I think the camera can kind of sneak right in between there. So what are we going to animate with our camera? Let's go to our coordinates, and first of all, we could zero out the rotation on our camera, and we can make sure that we're kind of more straight in front of it. So let's use our position to kind of dial in where our camera is. There we go. Just dialing in our camera. And now we're going to use the Z position to animate our camera, right? That's what we want to animate. So let's add a signal. Let's go to that Z position, drag it into signal. And you can see our endpoint is already set. That's why I wanted to set that endpoint first, because now our endpoint is there. And where do we want our beginning point to be? Well, we can control it, but right now it's 0, which is actually pretty close. That's just lucked out right there. And now we have an animation that comes out from the center. Okay, so the problem with this is we're missing the animation, right? Our camera's not coming out fast enough. So we could take this curve, and we could do something similar to what we did with the other curve, which is get the heck out. Give us some more time. In fact, I think we need more time in our timeline. Let's go to 100 frames. I'm going to add that 100 frames, and I'm going to take our end time and move it to 100. In fact, we have a button here with signal that just goes match timeline. And now this means that this curve is going to be applied to this parameter over the whole timeline. Swing. Glow text. Okay, even now I'm missing some of the animation, right? I want this to hold off a little bit. Okay, I want this animation to wait a little bit. So let's go back to our signal on our plane effector. Okay, and on our plane effector, we're going to delay the animation just a few frames. So instead of starting this animation on frame 0, we're going to start it on frame, let's go with 8. So now the animation is going to come on a little bit later, and I think we could even make the animation overall a little bit longer, maybe 80 frames. We have quite a few to work with. Let's see what this looks like. Awesome. Again, we can kick this out to our picture viewer before we have all the lights and all that stuff, and really just kind of see how we're feeling with the text, right? So I'll tell you one thing. That T touching the X, it's bugging me. It's bugging me. Excuse me. The text itself looks great. I like the blink. I like the colors. Glow text. Now, maybe we start that animation a little bit earlier, just so we could get some blinkies going on when they're closer up. So maybe let's try 4. Okay, and now let's also talk about how we angle the camera. So one more signal here on our camera, and we're going to animate in Z. Okay, and I call this Z, but it's HPB, right? And I never remember which is which, so I always drag them before I put them in a signal. But that's the one I want to animate. I'm going to bring this in, and I want to set a similar curve, okay, just like that. But I want to start at this angle and end it at 0. Okay, so that might be a little bit too steep, but now check this out. Okay, last little camera bit. I want the angle, this canting of our camera, to finish earlier. I want it to finish like right as soon as we can see the type. I kind of want to see it flat. So look at this. Frame 44 is where I want this to flatten out. I can come over to our end time and just go 44, and we have a new animation, right? And so, and that's why I use Signal, so I can just dial those things in. You could dial them in globally if you want everything to be the same. You could dial those in like that. But I think we got our animation looking pretty good. I think we got our timing looking good. And so let's start to work on our texture and our lighting overall. So let's make our text look nice and sexy, and then we'll add that floor and the reflectance stuff last. So let's talk about good glowy text. Well, this look here is made from a combination of our lit up textures, right? But you can also see there's reflections in here. So there's some reflectance going on right there. See the O, it's reflecting the W, and the T is reflecting the Y, and all that kind of stuff. Really fun stuff there. So we have to set that up. And then you can see that we also have these little edges, these little red and blue edges on our type. And that is actually from specular. Now, I rarely use specular, but with a look like this, where I just want to kind of accentuate the type, and I want it to just add a little bit of extra bling on the corners, I will throw a specular in here every once in a while. It really helps with this style of look, right? So let's show you how to set that up. First of all, before I go nuts, let's select our Motext. Let's go in here, turn on Show 3D GUI, and let's move that T over a little bit, okay? And let's also check out all of our kerning and make sure we're comfortable with it. Most of it's okay. I mean, I think you could cheat a little bit with this L. It's not bad. Most of it isn't bad. It's that T that was touching the X that was bugging me. And by the way, it's not touching the X if you look straight on. But because we're on an angle, it was touching. So keep that in mind. It's all about the visual representation, especially with 3D type. You look at it from a different angle, things can overlap, become unreadable, and you don't want that, right? Maybe this T and E come together. Okay, so now we got our animation here. Let's add a little bit of bevel to our text. So let's go to our caps, turn on a fillet cap. I'm going to add some steps to our edges here, and this is going to be our rounded edges. Okay, so you can also see as soon as we added some rounded edges, our letters started touching too. So what did I do? I messed up. I kerned before I thickened the letters. A couple things we need to do is, first of all, our radius probably won't be that big. It's going to be pretty minimal. And let's just throw a speck light in here and see what's going on. So I'm going to move this light up and in front here. And remember, we turned off our reflection channel early on, and our reflection channel by default has a specular on it. Okay, so let's look at our edges and see if those are big enough. We might want to thicken those caps a little bit. So let's go to our caps and go to radius and go, let's do 3 instead. And let's look at this specular light as one of the lights that's going to start to catch some of the edges on this type. Well, let's open up our reflectance and open up our specular channel and look at what we got. We have a nice round kind of like anthill of a specular. And if we instead crank it way up, make it super high but also sharper by moving our width in, it's going to be a lot more focused and a lot brighter. So you can see our edges now have a lot more definition, okay? However, still not bright enough. I think we could turn this a little wider, but mostly a lot higher, which we found earlier there. So we have inner width might help a little bit, but the strength, right? The overall strength. And I also don't like the way it's catching the front of these, so I'm going to move them off to the side, or alternatively, I can kind of take them up higher, or I could also angle them in a little bit so it's catching. And you can see we're actually able to see that specular being caught on all these little edges there. So boom, boom, little glows, 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 good. Okay, so our T is touching again. I messed up. Remember, I did my kerning afterwards. So what I think I'm going to do is just kick our horizontal spacing out a little bit. We got to make sure our animation is still good. Because if we move it out too far, our plane effector is going to start to affect it. See? Like if we hit render, it's going to be not all the way red. So remember that if you move the width of your text, just like we did here, let's go into our plane effector and actually extend it a little bit further. Because we want to make sure that T gets all the way around and the color is all the way done. Okay, I think we're good. I also want to move the position of our camera back a little bit. So there we go. Just tweak, real quick tweak there, signal. Okay, so now we got that. So this white specular is not really that pleasing. I'm going to add some color to it. I'm going to add a little orange to this specular, so that'll help match what we're up to as far as specular color goes there. And you can see it got really almost minimal. So we could turn that up. We could kind of pop it. Because it's a darker color, we're not getting as much bling from that edge as we could. I'm also considering that we might want to move it forward or backward a little bit. There we go. So that's what I'm trying to get rid of, is that glow. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Let's add another specular. This one's going to be more out front here. And let's make this one a little bit more blue, catch more of that light. And now we're starting to get some detail in our text, right? So we have this edge, and maybe we could buy one more radius here, 1 more centimeter of radius. There we go. So now it's catching even more. We're catching those little details, and that's when I like to use specular, when it's more of an illustrated look, and I'm just trying to catch some edges and make it pop a little bit more. I end up reaching for specular for those things, right? Okay, so that's good. What else can we do? Well, we can add some reflection to our actual image letters here so that they reflect each other. And so this is where we get to talk about reflectance and adding some layers here. So if you're not familiar with reflectance, we have a ton of videos online to help you get up and running with reflectance. I know it's new in the last couple of versions, and it works a lot different than a lot of other reflection. Basically, it works a lot different than old reflection, right? And you can follow those videos and learn how to add layers. But ultimately, we found the process of adding reflectance and tweaking reflectance pretty tedious inside of Cinema 4D, and that's why we made Topcoat. So Topcoat is a really cool tool to help you control your reflections inside of Cinema 4D and be able to layer them quickly. So I won't get too much into Topcoat. We have other videos for that, but I am going to use it in this tutorial because it makes not only this reflection so easy to make, but also when we get to the floor, you're really going to see the power of Topcoat and why we use this workflow. So what we want for this is just a slightly blurry reflection. And so we have a preset here that's pretty good. It's a gloss, but I want to keep my specular. So I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to add a gloss texture, and that's going to add gloss on top of our specular. And we can pull up an interactive render region here and kind of see what everything's looking like, right? And I want to really be able to start to see the reflections from one letter into the other. So how can we do that? Well, what I want to do is take our gloss and make the Fresnel less so that it's more reflective. And you can see now on this O, if we turn off our specular channel, just ignore that for now, this O is starting to show some reflection. Let's turn that Fresnel down a little bit more, and you're going to see it start to show up. So let's go to a place where it's kind of halfway in the middle, and look at this W. Look at the O into the W, and look at the W into the T. The T is actually reflecting into the W, and the W yellow is making that O even more yellow, right? So we're getting inner letter reflections. That's what we want. I'm also going to dial our blur down just a little bit. You can see that the blur on the W was a little bit much. Maybe I split the difference between that, and that's looking pretty good. And I think that'll be good. And then let's just check the reflections at the end here. So that was a real simple one that allowed us to get that look really quickly. While we're using Topcoat here, let's talk about render settings. If you're going to work with reflectance, you're going to work with anything with blurry reflections, you're going to want to switch to the physical render. And the physical render by default has some pretty high standards, right? The settings that they have by default start to make some of these renders take quite a long time. And so that's why for a lot of our products, we've been including this add render settings button, and it gives you a bunch of presets. So I'm going to add that and just go with light kit low. And the reason I'm going to go with light kit low is because we're not using global illumination in this render. We're just using kind of natural lighting, and it's going to allow us to see our changes really fast. Like, so watch how fast that renders. Ding. And then we start adding this floor, you're going to see it even more. You're going to start to see a lot of that detail. So one thing we didn't do is turn that specular back on. Look at how much that adds. And we could always tweak it later down the road. While we're here, I want to add one more spec. And we're going to get to the floor, totally promise. But now that we have a really fast render, I want to add one of these specs that is just a little bit in front of the camera. It starts to kind of pop the color there right on the top of our letters. So see that little glow right there? So this is all spec. However, we want this way down. I just want a little bit of a pop glow there. I'm just going to turn it up till I start to see it. I'm going to make it a little bit blue just to offset that orange a little bit, that red. So see that little glow? I think that gives it a little bit more depth. And it's all those little details, remember, talk a lot about this, but all those little details that add up to make something look more interesting as you have a little bit of hit of a light there all over the place. Okay, so we're getting to a point where we start to add the floor. So let's build this floor. We're going to use Mograph again. I'm going to use a plane. I'm going to scale this plane up until it's, till it goes past the camera. And then what we're going to do is take the plane, move it down, and we're going to clone onto this plane. So check this plane out. Let's go up in the air here. Let's turn off our interactive render region for a second and check out the plane. The plane has, let's go to lines. Plane has this grid. And this grid is how we're going to place all the tiles for the floor. So first of all, I want an odd number of tiles because I want this center one to line up where the camera is. I want the camera to be looking down a straight set of tiles instead of off to the side, right? So we got to make sure it's odd. So let's get our tile width kind of set the way we want. 43, it looks pretty good. So we'll do 43 by 43, okay? And that's going to allow us to add more tiles. And then let's add a cube. So we add a cube, and then we're going to go into a Mograph, and we're going to add a cloner. Now I'm going to hold down Alt as the cube selected, and that's going to make it a child of this cloner. You want your cube to be a child. In the cloner, we're going to go to Mode, Object, and we're going to take the plane and make that the object. So now check out what happens. A clone happens on every instance of this plane that we made, and it happens on the vertex, okay? We want it to happen on the polygon center so that it lines up with all those polygons we just set up. And then now we have to scale our cube down in order to make it fit, right? They're all overlapping right now, so we can scale this down. Look at that. So now we have all of our cubes, and now we have to shrink our cube down. And where do we have to shrink it, right? X, Y, Z, we need to shrink it in Y, and we need to shrink it down. So let's go with 10. Oh, look at that. So it didn't clone on its actual axis. So we have to find the correct one. Well, that's not right. This happens all the time. You just got to find the right one. So now we got it. So I want them to be pretty thin. There's our floor. And now what? We got to scale it up. While we're at this, let's go turn on render instances. So this will render way faster. It'll also allow us to move way faster. So look at how quick that is now. And let's go until they're almost touching, no touching, almost touching. And that's our scene. And now because we moved our camera just a little bit, we can grab our floor here. We can just kind of cheat this over so it looks a little bit more in line with our text. Okay, so that is our floor. Let's go ahead and add a little bit of detail to our floor by turning on the fillet here. And let's just make the radius super teeny. Okay. Maybe even smaller, 0.5, let's say. And that's looking good. Okay, so while we're here, let's add the reflective channel to the floor here, and let's start to dial in that reflection, because this is really a key part of that look that I showed you from here, is all this nice blurry floor and the way that the type's reflected and all the lines and all this stuff. So how do we do that? Well, that certainly isn't it, right? So we need a new material. And let's use Topcoat to build the material, and you'll see why we use Topcoat in a second, because we're able to layer stuff really quickly and alter it and change it. Let me show you. Right now we have no texture on the floor, so let's go to Topcoat. Let's just add a new chrome texture. It'll actually make a new texture. We could drag that onto our cube, and now all of our cube is just going to reflect the text. Now, why is it doing this weird thing? Well, when we added the fillet to our cube, right, let's turn that off. If we turn it off, it's just a straight up reflection. When we added that fillet, it bent the heck out of the top of that cube, and it bent basically the way that the cube thinks it exists in the real world. It's trying to connect those edges in a weird way. And the way you fix that is by adding segments to the right part of your cube. So if I add 20 segments to the top of our cube, we're going to get slightly different wiggle movements here. I mean, look at that, right? Now this is actually pretty interesting, but how do we get it even more? Well, we add more segments, right? The more we add, it should flatten out. Now, if that's not working, we want to go to our Phong angle and set this to something really low. Now, 2 is not usually the best thing to do because we have angles, but start to find what that angle is. Let's go with 10. No, it looks like we do have to go pretty low with this one. Okay, and now we can move our number back up here and kind of see what the good ratio is. We don't want too much geometry, but it looks like that might help us a little bit. But now we have a clean reflection, right? And frankly, I really didn't mind where it was when the Phong was a little higher, but I think it's going to confuse us when we start to add more different angles and stuff like that. So for the sake of the tutorial, we're going to turn this back down, but keep that in mind. You get a drastically different way of refracting and reflecting. And don't forget that affects on what this looks like as the letters get blown out and all this stuff. Okay, so we have a chrome look. That's not really what we want. What we really want is a more blurry floor as a base look. So I'm going to click dull and just see what that looks like. Okay, dull is pretty good. We're getting some nice reflection here, but I want more reflection. Well, there's 2 ways to do that. One is to turn down the Fresnel so that more angles catch reflection, right? So that's working. It's starting to bleed through a little bit more. Let's turn that down even more. That's good. And the other one is to turn up the reflection amount, so that'll add more reflection. And then yet another one is to turn down the blur amount. So instead of blurring it so much, why don't we turn that down? And now we're starting to get some nice kind of streaks coming through here, especially when these are all blinged out. Look at all that. Now it's pretty grainy now, and that's because we're using that render preset we talked about earlier, the low preset. Now we could be trying this with global illumination or ambient occlusion. I don't think we need that for this scene. I think we're just going to use practical lights, and the only practical lights here are the spec lights and the text. Now this reminds me, remember we set those lights up? We actually don't want these lights to affect anything other than the specular, right? Never use these lights, these point lights, to actually light your scene. I only use these point lights, these dumb omni lights here, to add specular because they're right there, they're all you need. And so I'm going to turn off diffuse, right? And because we're using a lot of reflectance, that really didn't affect much. But as we start to add more layers, just want you to remember, like, turn off GI illumination. You could turn off a lot of this stuff, but just keep the specular on, because if you turn that off, we'll lose all our blingy bling, right? Okay, so where were we? that's a good base layer for our glow text. I think it's a good place to start. Well, what's cool about reflectance and what makes it look really good is you can start to layer stuff on top of this. Okay, so let's go over to our top coat layers and let's look at what else we have. We have some really dull matte ones. But what I want to do is add a gloss layer on top of this. So if you ever want to add layers on top of things, you just hold down Shift and you add that layer. And now what we'll get is a slightly less blurry version that goes and sits on top of this other layer. In fact, I think it might be too blurry. I want to tone it down just a little bit. Okay, maybe I toned it down a little too much. I still want it to be blurry, but I want it to be less than the dull one. So this is pretty blurry. Kind of, you can't read it. So let's turn that one off. Let's turn on gloss. Good. So that's a little sharper. Now what else can we do? We could add another one. Let's add lacquer. So I'm going to shift click lacquer, and this is going to be a clean reflection on top of all of it. Right? So now we're layering our blur effects, and this is where things start to look realistic, and you're able to affect all of these differently. One thing we could do is this mirror reflection is just too perfect. So we can go to our lacquer layer. We can go over here to bumps, and we could say add a subtle noise to all of this. Right? Check that out. Now we're getting this noise on top of everything. Well, even that subtle noise is not subtle enough for me, so I'm going to turn down our bump depth. Oh, well, it looks like I turned it down too much. Let's turn it up a little bit more. And I'm going to take our bump scale, and I'm going to say probably bigger. So I want those waves to be a little bit bigger. And we're trying to make those imperfections on the floor look right. That looks better to me. Might be able to knock it one more down, maybe two more. But it's really getting subtle here. That's what I'm talking about. See those little wrinkles? It's almost like whoever polished the floor, you know, used this nice lacquer. They did as good of a job as they could, but it's got these little wrinkles in it. Let me turn off everything else. You can see what's going on. Look at that. Right? And just that alone, maybe not. But as you start to layer these up, you're going to get a really realistic looking floor here. Okay, so what else can we do? Well, we can add this to our gloss layer as well. Before we leave our lacquer layer, though, let's add a mask. And I'm just going to use, let's go with holes. And holes is going to add little divots in the floor that don't reflect. And this is a subtle effect. We may have to turn up the resolution for this. But the divots will, as our camera moves, show parts of the floor that are worn differently. Let's make a more clear example here, just so you can see it. But check that out. Now, things are reflecting more or less wherever there's different parts of the scene. This galvanized one is really nice. And it'll give us nice little divots and chunks on the floor. So all of these give us those details that start to make our scene look more and more like it's in the real world and less like it's in a 3D world. So I like this wrinkle on the text here. Let's go to our gloss and do something similar, which is add a bump to it. This one I'm going to add nothing too crazy, maybe just this sand texture, which is going to make it a little bit more blurry. And I like the way that looks. So if you want to see a little bit more about how that looks, you can turn up your render settings and just do like a nice high-res render and see all the little detail. And we will do that toward the end here. Before we leave, though, I'm going to add a little bit more blur to our dull reflection. I'm also going to turn that reflection up and turn our Fresnel down even more. I want this outside blur to be a little bit hotter. And don't forget, you can also come in and change the colors of your layers. And this will change the way that things reflect. So, for example, we can make this top layer here more blue. And that's just going to add this nice little subtle blue tint to everything, right? And I think I want to keep that blue, but not so blue that it really tints it that heavily. Just want a little bit. That's better. So look at that, all that stuff. So what does this look like with a higher res setting? Well, we can come in here, we can check that out. We can go to Light Kit Medium, come in here and let this render, right? And that's going to give us even less noise. In fact, we can go to our render settings and say, all right, I want just a current frame. Let's make a current frame for all of them. Current frame. And now we can start to compare and contrast using these render settings. So here's Light Kit Pro. Or I said Pro, I meant low. I've been saying Light Kit Pro for too many years. Light Kit Low. So that introduces some grain, you know, but it's really fast to render. We're talking 3 seconds for that thing. Let's go to medium. Cleaner grain there. And now high. Now I don't even think high is going to be enough for this. We have such a blurry floor here. We may have to crank it up even more. But look at how much cleaner that is. Just going between these three. Grainy, medium, high. And look at how these combine. I mean, this looks like a wet, glossy, lacquered floor. And it's all about layering those things up. So pretty cool. We might turn it up a little bit more at the end, and I'll show you how to do that toward the end. But let's see what this looks like when it's more on an angle here. And you can see as we turn up our render settings, you know, it takes a little bit longer to see, but we're going to see it in a little bit more detail. But I love that. Like, look at the floor. Look at the way that specular reflects off the floor right there. All this little warbly noise and stuff like that. So, all right, I'm digging where we are. Let's go to light kit low. And let's add one more light. I'm going to use a volumetric light to give a little bit of color to this scene. So I'm just going to move it up. And I'm going to go to our light, visible light, and say visible. It's actually not volumetric. It's just visible is what I want. Volumetric, you don't always need it for this effect. I just want to add a little glow behind our text to kind of offset our text from the scene. So let's move it back in the scene a little bit so it's definitely behind. And let's obviously crank it way back, but let's tint it a little bit blue, and then we'll tone this down. And we can go way back. Like, look at this, 7%. Still visible, 4%. Still visible, 3%. Like, that's the kind of hint I'm talking about. That's a little. And now I can scale this up and get even more. But now we're talking. That little, look at that. That little change, how much did that change the tone of this whole scene? Right? This is flat, a little bit, you know, a little generic. Boom, you add a little hint, and it's popping on the floor there, right? But what do we have to do on this? We have to turn it off on the floor, right? Or I guess what I should say is we should see what this looks like without it hitting the floor. How do we do that? We turn off our diffuse. And now we don't want that to hit the floor. Now in this case, we are actually getting a little bit of light, and it's because reflectance is a little bit agnostic to where it's getting its reflections. You don't have as much control over physical render in some cases. Like I'm just reminded as I did this, look at that. Our floor is actually not ignoring this light. Isn't that crazy? So how can we solve that? Well, we could try to go on our cube, go on to compositing tag, and in the compositing tag, we can go exclude this light. Did that work? See, look at that. That didn't even work. So physical render, with some of these things, you gotta be careful, because here's, well, I'll say it this way. The physical render and the physical lights and reflectance look so good because they work like the real world, because they're calculated to work like the real world. However, when things are made to work in the real world, you also have real world limitations, which is you cannot put a light in a room and have it hit the floor and then go tell the floor in a real lighting situation that you don't want it to look at that light, right? You can't do that. So I don't know. I mean, I'm at this point, we're experimenting a little bit. So let's try one more thing. And if we can't figure this out, I'll have some homework to do. And that's okay. So I'm gonna open this up, and I'm gonna turn it off. What I'm trying to do is block that light to hit the floor, but the problem is I can't block the light without blocking the text. So already I know, like, this isn't gonna work, right? I'm trying to like solve this problem on the fly, and we're not getting there, right? So, two things we could do before we move on is A, add this in post, add this glow that we love so much in post, and then that way our floor is nice and clean, right? B, we could render this out in layers and take different, use the take system or something, turn off that light for the floor render and leave on the text and do it that way. Or we could say, it looks pretty good actually. Convince ourselves that this is what we wanted the whole time. So in the sake of, for tutorial land, I'm gonna just turn this light down one more notch so it's not too heavy anywhere. We're gonna accept that this is now a part of our life. And we're gonna go. Because now we're gonna try to dial up our render settings and figure all this out. So the first thing I do before I start to go crazy with the render settings is make sure I like the timing and the whole animation, the whole thing. So I'm gonna go to Light Kit Draft, which is gonna be super grainy, but watch how fast this renders. I'm gonna go turn on lock ratio and go, all right, I want this to be 600 pixels wide, and I wanna go to all frames, and I'm actually gonna skip a frame too, frame step 2, okay? So what this is gonna do is render every other frame. It's gonna render at super low quality, and hopefully we'll get a full animation here in less than a minute. It looks like we did. Now the only thing you want you to keep in mind is right now the animation speed is at 24 frames a second. And if we skip every frame, look at, we're only rendering 50 frames out of 100. So what does our playback speed have to be? Well, our playback speed has to be 12 in order for us to look at this and go, that looks the way we want it to. So now, this is a slow, I'm just gonna zoom in on this so we can see it. This is a super low res version of where we're hanging out. That looks pretty good. I like the animation. I like the colors. I like, try to squint and look at it without all the grain. I'm digging this. I'm feeling it. I think the only thing I want to do is I want to zoom out a little bit further for the final bit here. I want to be further away. And so that's easy. We can go into our scene here. And because we use Signal, we can go to our camera and just say, I want you to be further. Done. Right? Everything else is the same. We're just further away at the end. Awesome. Okay, so I'm digging that. So now let's dial up our render settings until we get it right. So this is where I want to go to, if you ever want to change settings on all presets at once, you got to go back to the top here. And we have videos, if you have Top Coat, about how to use all these presets. But I'll walk you through a little bit here. If you go up to the top, you can then pick current frame. And now we're just going to render the current frame. Okay, so let's go to Light Kit High. And let's do a render of this frame. We can zoom it back. And we could check the grain, right? And because we're using these presets, all we're really looking for is grain. How much grain is acceptable? Well, this is pretty clean. However, there's a little bit of grain in the middle here, and this rendered fast enough to where, I think we could crank up the settings a little bit, and our client, we won't be mad, our client won't be mad. I think we'll still be in a good position. You know what I'm saying? So let's turn it up. Well, how do we turn it up? We're already at Light Kit High. Well, if you ever hit this point, and this is true with anything, even if you're not using Top Coat presets, if you're ever using the physical render, and you're topped out, and you're like, well, how do I turn it up now? You could turn up this sampling subdivision, and you'll be pretty sure that even just by adding one number to this, that it will look about twice as good. Now, the problem with it looking twice as good is it'll render in about twice the time as well. So that one number, literally, not by doubling this, not from going to 4 to 8, but from going to 4 to 5, should roughly double your render time and make it look about twice as good, right? That's a rough feeling, but look at the difference. You probably, because we're recording this, can't tell a huge difference between these. This one probably looks fine, but try to focus on, let's go the edge. Let's look at the grain right here or the grain right here, and look at how grainy that is, and then how that starts to clean it up. But look at our render time, 20 seconds, 40 seconds. Technically that's 39 seconds, but how much more clear can you get? This is how you have to start to think about your render settings. And the other number you can look at is blurriness subdivision. Let's turn that up by 1. And we'll do one more render here. And the key is we're looking for grain. We're looking at our render times. We're calculating, we're multiplying this out by how many frames we have. So remember, we have 100 frames. If this render took a minute, let's say, which I'm thinking it'll roughly be around a minute. Clear bottom there. That's good. The details look nice. The little glows look nice. Everything's looking pretty good. So it looks like this render will be close to a minute. And we extrapolate that out into all of our frames, and we know that roughly it'll take 100 minutes to render this at the current resolution, at the current settings, right? That makes sense. However, if you have a render farm, you could start to cut that in half, or roughly in half, as you add more machines, right? So that's, roughly how you can start to calculate these things. But I know with pretty good, because we're not using global illumination, because we're not using anything too crazy here, I know that, look at that. I didn't plan this, folks. It's exactly a minute. It's exactly a minute to render this scene, which looks pretty good to me, honestly. The grain looks good. The quality looks good. And the reflection, the amount of detail in that reflection for a minute is I think, worth it. So from this point, all you need to do, your settings are great. You go to output and you go to all frames and you kick that out. Now, don't forget earlier we set this frame step to 2. If you did that, make sure you set that back, check everything else, and you should pop out your scene. So let me quickly head into After Effects and talk about some of the effects that I added to this scene, just to give it the last little bit of kind of effect here. So if we go into our scene, I just wanted to break this down. I didn't want to start from scratch in here, but you can see, let me solo what we started with by default. Okay, so here's the solo of our main layer with no motion blur, nothing there. And this is what we have. Bling, bling, bling. Looking good, right? Okay, so let's take that and look at all the layers. So first of all, I added some motion blur. So you can see when I turn on motion blur, that little bit of motion blur is going to make it look a lot more realistic as we come through. And I use Real Smart Motion Blur. Always works really nice. And next I use glow highlights. Now glow highlights pretty subtle. I actually turned it way down. But glow highlights just going to catch these little edges and start to bling them out a little bit. So above that, let's just turn on the second layer here. Second layer is a glow layer. This layer has a fast blur on it. And you can set your pixel amount. There's their blur, right? And then I'm screening it on top of the bottom layer. So that's screen mode on top of the bottom. So that's second layer, boom. Third layer. Third layer has a directional blur on it. And let me turn up the opacity so you can see what it does. That's what it's doing, but I have it way down. I have it set to 7%. Really little. It actually shows up more here. I wanted this bling, and I animated the rotation of this so it moved around. Okay? So that's that layer. Next is a black solid. That just does a little fade in. Whoop, like that. And then we have our overall adjustments. Our overall adjustments are just a little bit of a curve. Honestly, I think I removed the curve. Mostly it's pulling back on the saturation. But this curve, look at how subtle it is. That little bit. Like, I wanted that to be that different. So let's A/B it. Let's turn it off. Turn it on. Is it worth it? You decide. But this is where you want to do that. You can bring this up, bling it out a little bit more. You can make the darks going to go down and, fade it out, give it that look. You can tweak that up. But that's where I ended up with this. I think we got to a good point. Thanks everybody for watching. Now don't forget we have hundreds more tutorials just like this over on our website at greyscalegorilla.com/tutorials. And don't forget you can sign up for our Intro to Cinema 4D class, over 30 hours of free Cinema 4D training to get you up and running with Cinema 4D. So please check that out. Thanks again for watching this video, and I hope to see you in another tutorial really soon. Bye everybody. Koozies. I love koozies. Do you have a Greyscalegorilla koozie? I got a Greyscalegorilla koozie. Come see me at events and say, Nick, give me a koozie. And if I have a koozie, you get a koozie.